Almost everyone has experienced this feeling at some point. You check your bank account and immediately start calculating. What bills are coming? What payments are pending? What can wait? What cannot? And even when income is technically enough to survive, the mental pressure still remains. Not always panic, sometimes something quieter than that. A constant background tension operating underneath everyday life. And after a while, many people begin assuming this feeling is simply normal adulthood. That stress is unavoidable, permanent, just part of modern life. But once a pattern becomes common enough across millions of people, it becomes important to ask whether the pressure is purely personal or partially structural, because financial stress rarely comes from one single source. It usually develops through systems operating continuously over time, quietly, gradually, repeatedly. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston, your synthetic financial educator. This content is educational commentary only and is not personalized financial advice, so always research financial decisions carefully. One of the most important things to understand about financial stress is that stress is not always caused by visible financial collapse. In many cases, stress exists even while life appears completely functional externally. The paycheck arrives. The bills get paid. The routine continues. Nothing looks catastrophic from the outside, and yet internally many people still feel financially fragile. That distinction matters, because financial stress is often less about visible failure and more about perceived stability, or more specifically, how stable life feels underneath the surface. Now, this becomes easier to understand once recurring obligations enter the picture, because recurring obligations quietly reshape emotional relationships with money over time. Rent, vehicle payments, subscriptions, insurance, debt payments, utilities, recurring costs that continue existing regardless of mood, energy, or life circumstances. And once enough obligations accumulate simultaneously, future income begins arriving partially committed before the paycheck even appears. That changes emotional experience significantly, because part of the future already belongs somewhere else. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean someone is irresponsible. That's important to understand clearly. Many financially responsible people still experience continuous financial pressure, because the issue is often structural exposure. The more recurring obligations attached to future income, the less flexibility remains underneath the surface. And reduced flexibility changes emotional experience automatically. Now, flexibility matters more than most people initially realize, because flexibility creates psychological breathing room, the ability to tolerate uncertainty, unexpected expenses, income interruptions, life changes. But once flexibility narrows far enough, even small disruptions begin feeling emotionally significant. A car repair feels heavier. A medical bill feels heavier. A missed paycheck feels heavier. Not necessarily because the event itself changed, but because the structure surrounding the event became less flexible over time. Now, another important layer here involves normalization, because human beings normalize stress surprisingly quickly. At first, financial pressure feels temporary. Then eventually it becomes familiar. And once something becomes familiar enough emotionally, people stop questioning it deeply. They adapt around it instead. That adaptation process is one of the most important psychological forces in modern financial life. People adjust routines, adjust expectations, adjust emotional baselines, and eventually many people stop expecting financial life to feel stable emotionally at all. They begin assuming low-level pressure is simply normal. Now, this creates something subtle but important. People begin organizing life around maintaining stability rather than expanding flexibility. Protecting the paycheck, protecting recurring systems, protecting continuity. Because once financial structures become dependent on uninterrupted income flow, stability itself becomes emotionally critical. Now, this does not mean stability is bad. Stability matters. Predictability matters. Responsibility matters. The deeper issue is what happens when the entire emotional structure of life becomes dependent on uninterrupted financial continuity. Because dependence changes behavior. Risk tolerance changes. Career flexibility changes. Stress sensitivity changes. And eventually many people begin feeling trapped inside structures that technically still appear functional externally. Now, another important reason financial stress becomes so persistent is because modern systems continuously increase cognitive load. There are more subscriptions, more recurring payments, more notifications, more decisions, more financial tracking, more digital obligations operating constantly in the background of daily life. And human beings were not necessarily designed to continuously process dozens of invisible recurring systems simultaneously. That ongoing cognitive pressure matters psychologically. Because stress is not only mathematical, it is attentional. The more systems requiring continuous mental tracking, the more emotional bandwidth financial life begins consuming over time. Now, modern convenience systems amplify this even further, because convenience often reduces immediate effort, while quietly increasing recurring structural dependency underneath the surface. Food delivery, subscription ecosystems, deferred payments, automatic renewals, instant financing systems, all of these reduce friction in the short term. But collectively, they often increase structural complexity over time, and structural complexity quietly increases emotional pressure, especially once obligations become normalized enough to disappear psychologically into the background. Now, another important factor here is uncertainty, because financial stress is rarely caused only by present obligations. It is often amplified by future uncertainty. People worry about unexpected expenses, economic instability, job interruptions, health emergencies, housing costs, future affordability. And once future uncertainty combines with reduced present flexibility, emotional pressure often becomes continuous rather than temporary. That's why many people experience financial stress even during periods where nothing catastrophic is actively happening, because structurally, the margin for disruption already feels narrow underneath the surface. Now, social comparison quietly intensifies this process. Modern culture continuously exposes people to curated versions of stability and success. Through social media, advertising, entertainment, and consumer culture, people repeatedly see lifestyles that appear comfortable, organized, stable, upgraded, successful. And over time, comparison quietly reshapes emotional expectations. Not because people consciously choose comparison constantly, because repeated exposure changes perceived normality automatically. Now, this creates another layer of financial stress many people rarely discuss openly. The emotional pressure of feeling behind, even when basic needs are technically being met. Because modern financial culture often treats visible comfort as evidence of success. And once lifestyle becomes emotionally associated with personal value, financial stress begins affecting identity itself. Now, another reason financial stress persists is because modern financial systems are heavily optimized around recurring obligation structures. Monthly systems create predictability, predictable payments, predictable consumption, predictable financial behavior, and predictable systems become extremely stable structurally. Again, this is not about conspiracy, it's about incentives. Systems naturally evolve toward repeatable patterns because repeatable systems reduce uncertainty. But repeatable obligations also create repeated emotional pressure over time, especially once future income becomes increasingly committed before arrival. Now, eventually, many people stop evaluating financial life through long-term flexibility at all. Instead, life becomes evaluated through continuity. Can the structure continue functioning? Can the obligations continue being maintained? Can the routine remain uninterrupted? And once continuity becomes the primary emotional goal, financial life often starts feeling increasingly fragile beneath the surface. Not because collapse is guaranteed, but because flexibility has narrowed quietly over time. Now, none of this means financial stress is purely external. Personal behavior absolutely matters. Decisions matter. Patterns matter. But systems matter too. Environment matters. Normalization matters. Recurring obligations matter. And understanding those structural influences changes how financial pressure gets interpreted emotionally. Because once systems become visible, stress stops feeling completely random. Now, understanding this should not create hopelessness. Hopelessness usually reduces clarity. The goal is perspective. Because perspective changes observation. Instead of viewing financial stress purely as personal failure, you begin recognizing larger structural patterns operating underneath modern financial life. Obligation patterns, normalization patterns, flexibility patterns, stability dependence patterns. And once those systems become visible, financial life becomes easier to analyze more calmly. not emotionally, more analytically. You begin noticing how recurring obligations affect flexibility, how normalized pressure affects expectations, how convenience systems quietly expand structural dependency over time. And awareness matters because systems become easier to navigate once they stop feeling invisible. Not instantly, not perfectly, but progressively. Because visibility changes perspective, and perspective changes attention. Now, financial life is rarely shaped by one dramatic moment. It is usually shaped through repeated systems operating quietly beneath everyday awareness. Small obligations, small recurring pressures, small normalized adjustments repeated consistently across years. And once those patterns become visible, financial stress starts feeling less mysterious. Because the deeper issue is often not one isolated problem, but the accumulation of systems operating continuously underneath everyday life. And understanding that changes how financial pressure itself gets interpreted over time. Less personally, more structurally, more clearly. Because clarity often reduces emotional noise more effectively than constant anxiety ever can. And every lesson in this series is designed to make those hidden systems easier to see clearly. That concludes today's lesson. Peace. If this lesson helped you see money a little differently, then stay with the series. Because financial understanding is not built from one idea. It is built layer by layer. One system, one pattern, one hidden behavior at a time. This first month is focused on the financial lessons many adults were never properly taught growing up. How money moves, how debt works, how stress builds, how behavior gets shaped, and how modern financial systems quietly influence everyday life. So watch the next lesson when you're ready, and keep building the foundation. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston. Peace.